Hello, and welcome to one of several webinars that is designed to introduce eligible applicants to the National Disaster Resilience Competition that is part of the Community Development Block Grant Program. My name is Carrie Whitehead. I work in HUD's Office of General Counsel, and I serve as lead program counsel to several programs administered under HUD's Office of Community Development, Office of Community Planning and Development, including the program that's the subject of this webinar.
And I'm Todd Richardson. I'm in HUD's Office of Policy Development and Research, and I'm going to be talking about the data that's required to meet this threshold of most impacted and distressed and continuing unmet needs.
The National Disaster Resilience Competition will make approximately $1 billion available to communities that have been struck by natural disasters in 2011, 2012, and 2013. The competition will promote risk assessment and planning, and will fund the implementation of innovative resilience projects to better prepare communities for future storms and extreme events. Next slide. In the coming days, HUD will release a series of webinars, as I mentioned, to review the details of this competition, and specifically the details that are contained in the Notice of Funding Availability, which is commonly referred to as a NOFA. In this webinar in particular, we will provide a brief overview of the NOFA as an introduction, but we're really going to focus on, beyond the major elements of the competition, the two exclusive requirements that are thresholds to this competition. Those are the Unmet Recovery Needs threshold and the Most Impacted and Distressed threshold criteria. I think it's important to talk about what a threshold criteria is. A threshold is a minimum standard. It's required by law, and an applicant must meet that legally required standard. Applications that do not meet the threshold criteria for this NOFA will not be scored, and HUD will not consider them for funding. Over the course of this presentation, we will review the criteria for both of these two thresholds. There are other thresholds associated with this NOFA. We are only focused on these two and the data that is necessary for eligible applicants to use to support these two threshold criteria. We're also going to outline a process that's very unique to this NOFA. This NOFA will allow eligible applicants to submit pre-application requests to HUD to review the criteria for these two thresholds. We are going to talk about a little bit about what that request should contain and how it should be formatted and where it should be sent. And then finally, we're going to provide a summary of the resources that are available to eligible applicants as they put together their proposals, and they're trying to meet both the Unmet Recovery Needs criteria and the Most Impacted and Distressed criteria. First, I'm going to provide just a little bit of general background about the program itself, where it comes from. HUD has really been involved in disaster recovery since the department's inception. HUD played a significant role in recovery in hurricanes going back to Hurricane Agnes and Hurricane Camille in 1969. The National Disaster Resilience Competition is built on the back of the Community Development Block Grant Program. Now, this program is commonly referred to as CDBG for short. You'll probably hear us use that term in this presentation. And so I wanted to tell you a little bit about the CDBG program itself. This program is very flexible. There are over 25 eligible activities that are provided for under the statute. And because of the flexibility in terms of eligibility, communities can use this program to meet really unique community development needs. And CDBG actually celebrates its 40th birthday this year. It is one of the longest continuously run programs at HUD, actually. And normally, this program provides assistance through annual grants that are provided through formula funding, and they are given to states and to certain communities that are designated as entitlement communities under the statute, which just means that they are large enough to receive a grant allocation of their own. When it comes to disaster recovery, we're talking about a unique set of CDBG appropriations. Now, generally, FEMA is the agency within the federal community that has the lead response for federal disaster recovery immediately following a disaster. But since 1993, from time to time, Congress has decided that some additional funding is needed to supplement the largest of the disasters that affect communities across the nation. And so Congress chose the CDBG program as a vehicle to provide that supplemental assistance because of the flexibility that CDBG brings to the table. CDBG is really good at filling in the gaps that are not met by other local, state, and federal resources. So Congress first used this vehicle after 9/11 as a multi-billion-dollar funding vehicle. And so since that time, communities who have been hardest hit by disasters and have been recipients of this type of funding have continued to press innovation forward as they move forward with their recovery. And the National Disaster Resilience Competition represents even more innovation in this field and through the CDBG chassis. It is designed to take that innovation completely to the next level, and the idea is to move forward to a more resilient future. So the competition is funded through an appropriation made by Congress. The appropriation was made to the CDBG program for disaster recovery specifically. And I'd like to point out that even though the appropriation, which was made under Public Law 113-2, came immediately after Sandy, when Congress made the appropriation to the CDBG program, it made it to supplement disaster recovery for major disasters that were presidentially declared under the Stafford Act in calendar years 2011, 2012, and 2013. So when the president first announced this competition in June, he started to talk about this innovation. He really identified the need to support innovative resilience projects at the local level while encouraging communities to adopt policy changes and activities and plan for the impacts of extreme weather conditions. In essence, this National Disaster Resilience Competition is really designed to make investments in becoming more resilient at the same time that it's furthering a community's recovery needs at the individual level. And so HUD designed this year-long competition to occur in 2 phases. And the 2-phase approach is necessary in order to really gather all the information that's needed to put together the best and most innovative proposals. These 2 phases are going to be one at a first phase at the concept level. This phase is really about risk assessment. It's about planning. And then there's a second phase that's more at the project level. And the second phase is going to involve design and implementation. So during phase 1, applicants are going to develop innovative, data-driven, and community-led approaches to recover from the disasters that they are affected by in 2011 through 2013. And they're also going to think about how they can increase resilience to future threats. HUD will review the applications submitted from phase 1 and select a smaller subset of eligible applicants who will be invited to submit an application for phase 2. So the applicants that come to phase 2 are going to be asked to design solutions that go a little bit further into that resilience and the recovery. And the best proposals will receive funds for implementation of specific projects that demonstrate how communities across the country can build a more resilient future. I don't want to go into a whole lot of detail about the aspects that will fall under phase 1 and phase 2 because these will be covered by a longer webinar with a lot more detail that will be posted on the web. I do want to give a little bit of background on the 2 thresholds. These are the thresholds that we're going to go into today in depth, and they both have a statutory basis. So first, let's look at the most impacted and distressed threshold. This threshold comes directly from the statutory language. The statute says that assistance will be provided for certain recovery activities in the most impacted and distressed areas resulting from a major disaster declared pursuant to the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act. these were disasters that were going to be, that were declared by the president in response to Hurricane Sandy and other eligible disasters in 2011 through 2013, as I mentioned. What does this mean? It means that HUD has a responsibility to allocate funds not just to the counties that were declared a disaster. And when the president declares the disaster, he works with FEMA. These declarations are made at the county level. So beyond the county level, we need to make a measurement of where the most impacted and distressed areas are. In some cases, that is going to be for the most severely and hard-hit communities with the highest damage rates. It's going to be maybe countywide. In those counties that have countywide designations, HUD has already made a determination about where these areas are, who are most impacted and distressed across the country. Then there is a second subset that maybe did not right off the bat jumped out as being catastrophic in nature because their damage levels were not as high. Maybe they had initially enough, what looked like to be a little bit more funding coming from other assistance, such as insurance, SBA, or FEMA. But within a particular county, you might have a subset, a small county area that is severely impacted or highly distressed and is having a very difficult time recovering, either because of stressors that occurred prior to the disaster that are impeding recovery after the disaster, or because of highly concentrated damage. Todd's going to go into a lot more detail about the representation of those two different types of most impacted and distressed areas that's going to be very data-driven. But I just wanted to point out the concept that for instances where HUD has already made an appropriation, you may be talking about countywide areas when you're talking about this threshold, but for other disasters that have not yet been awarded funds from HUD, you may be talking about a subset area. I also want to talk a little bit about the unmet needs criteria. The unmet needs threshold also comes from the statute. The unmet need word or phrase does not appear in the statute itself, but Congress did limit the use of these funds to necessary expenses for these certain categories of disaster recovery. And when we think of necessary expenses, we think of the expenses that are not covered by other sources. If there is another source available to fund a particular activity, then use of CDBG is not necessary to come in and duplicate that assistance. And there are two provisions in particular, one coming from the statute and the other referenced in the statute but coming from the Stafford Act, that enforce that. The Stafford Act includes a prevention of the duplication of benefits in Section 312 of the Stafford Act, and then the statute itself does say that in instances where funds are made available by FEMA or by the Army Corps, HUD may not also make a provision of assistance available for the same activity or portion of activity. So to the extent that a portion of an activity is covered by another source, the CDBG disaster recovery assistance is not available for that same entity. And that's really what the unmet recovery need criteria is getting at its heart. I also want to talk a little bit about why we are looking at new data now. So HUD has made disaster recovery allocations under Public Law 113-2 already based on the best available data. It made these allocations, the initial allocations, pretty close to the time at which HUD had data available, much closer to the storms themselves or other types of disasters themselves that affected communities in 2011, 2012, and 2013. At this point in time, late 2014, we are actually much further away from the disasters. So HUD looked at this competition as a means of providing to HUD or soliciting from eligible applicants better data. The Public Law 113-2 does include a requirement that HUD make allocations based on best available data. So that's why you're seeing a data-driven process at this time. And HUD is going to factor into its consideration of how to make allocations under this competition the data estimating unmet recovery needs in most impacted and distressed areas as required by statute. And I do want to point out at this time, although we will talk about it much later in the presentation, that HUD is going to allow each applicant to submit one time only a request to HUD within the first 45 days after the NOFA publication to look at the data to support both the most impacted and distressed threshold and the unmet recovery needs threshold, and make a determination as to whether the information provided would be sufficient to meet the threshold criteria for each of those. HUD will look at the request and will either confirm or reject the submission. Once that rejection or confirmation has been made, the grantee should not submit another request within the 45-day period. We will only review one request per applicant. This is very unique to this particular NOFA. And so we'll talk a little bit more about what that request should look like later on in the presentation. I would also like to point out that the threshold criteria that Todd is getting ready to review are going to be located in Appendix G of the NOFA. So just briefly, on the most impacted and distressed threshold criteria in Phase 1, I'd like to point out that the Appendix G criteria that are very data-driven should be summarized and submitted together with all of the other thresholds by the applicant in Exhibit B to the NOFA. The NOFA response will be submitted as an attachment to the narrative submission of the NOFA. There are some specific things that must be included. The area that the threshold is trying to meet must be identified by place name and census or the census tract code in the target area that the applicant has identified as most impacted and distressed resulting from the qualified disaster, and this submission in Exhibit B must demonstrate the unmet recovery need. I do want to point out, however, that the unmet recovery needs and the most impacted and distressed criteria are referenced again as part of the different rating factors in Phase 1 and as well as Phase 2. And your Exhibit B response is going to be separate and apart from your rating factor response. The Exhibit B narrative response will not count against page limits. The rating factor response will count against page limits. And so the narrative must provide a link to the data supporting the applicant's support for the unmet recovery needs as described in the NOFA. In Phase 2, HUD anticipates that because of the time that's passed, because the proposal will be moving from a conceptual proposal to a more specific proposal that is very honed in on a particular project, that the applicant will have a lot more specific information with regards to both its most impacted and distressed threshold criteria and the unmet recovery needs threshold criteria. And so HUD anticipates that the responses in Phase 2 will be much longer, but this is just an estimate. In any case, a Phase 2 submission can reference back to a Phase 1 assessment. And there is no need to restate the exact words that are included in Phase 1. They can be referenced, but there should be a lot more detail and thought going into unmet recovery need and most impacted and distressed thresholds at the second level. And then, as the NOFA states, HUD will award more points to more accurate, detailed, and robust descriptions of unmet recovery needs when it comes to the rating factors. So Todd is now going to walk us through the nitty-gritty of the data and how it should be presented by applicants to this program.
Thank you very much, Carrie. So this slide provides an overview of the different ways applicants can meet the threshold requirement Carrie was just discussing. I'm going to walk through this slide and then go into the details on later slides. The top row of this slide represents the AND requirements. So an applicant must show that they have a target area that was most impacted by a covered disaster, that it has a distress characteristic, and that it has some remaining unmet needs, recovery needs associated with the covered disaster. The second row, the one labeled for the already demonstrated by HUD, the second row shows that if the target area is within one of the 64 counties HUD has already determined to be most impacted and distressed, then you will only need to tell us you will not need to tell us those two threshold requirements, but you will still need to tell us the unmet recovery needs that you have remaining. Finally, the third row are for the outside of those 64 counties that are already designated as most impacted by HUD. There were over 2,000 counties with a major declared disaster in 2011, 2012, and 2013. And this third row speaks to how applicants for one of those counties might be able to show that they are most impacted and distressed and have continuing unmet needs. One thing to note on this is that going down the column for most impacted characteristics, you'll see that there are 4 categories of potential damage areas you can show for most impacted: housing, infrastructure damage, economic impact, and environmental degradation. You need only show one of those as having significant damage in order to be able to meet the most impacted criteria for your target area. For that target area, would then move on to the distress characteristic, and you only need to meet one of these distress characteristics for that target area. And then for the third column, you would need to only meet one of these requirements of having continuing unmet recovery needs. This slide here shows those states that have the 64 counties that have previously been determined most impacted. It also shows the 17 jurisdictions that are in a subset of those counties that can apply independent of their state because they've been designated as most impacted and distressed. For areas in the other counties that are not in these local jurisdictions that are most impacted and distressed, they would need to apply with the state. This slide represents the other states that have had declared disasters in the last in 11, 12, or 13 that that could apply for this, but they will need to show most impacted and distressed in the counties that they identify as in the target areas they identify. In addition to the states that have most impacted and distressed counties, if they have a county that is outside of one of the already identified counties, they will need to show most impacted and distressed for those counties. Let's start with most impacted. So this is our first category. For those counties, for those areas outside of the 64 counties that are already most impacted, they'll need to show in their target area, which can be a census tract or a place, damage to housing that occurred as a result of the disaster. This is at the time of the disaster. They need to show there was significant damage at the time of the disaster. For housing, a minimum of 100 homes damaged or a minimum of 20 homes seriously damaged. We will be providing a file on our website that shows those census tracts and places that we have data from FEMA registrant data that show that that meet this criteria. The second category, infrastructure. You need to show that that this disaster in that target area caused $2 million or greater damage to permanent infrastructure. For the third category, economic revitalization, you'll need to show that that this caused an increase in unemployment, or that there are a number of people who were displaced by their employment for an extended period of time, or there's some other harm to the economy. And then the last category is environmental degradation. In this case, you need to demonstrate there was damage to natural resources and that because of that damage to the natural resources, it has placed housing, infrastructure, or economic revitalization at risk. For the area you've identified as most impacted, we then moved on to the category of distressed. Distressed is largely conditions prior to the disaster that would make recovery more difficult. These include areas that were low and moderate income. Those data on areas that HUD has designated as low and moderate income are available from the Community Development Block Grant website for that program. A shortage of affordable rental housing. In this case, these are areas that would have a large number of renters that have severe rent burden, or there's assisted housing that was in the affected area and have high risk of damage for a future event. The third category are federal target or economically fragile areas. These include tribal areas, promise zones, strong cities, strong communities, or areas with unemployment rates greater than 125% of the national average. Finally, a fourth category, and remember these are all ORs. You don't have to satisfy all of these requirements, just one of them. Having prior environmental distress. So it may contain a contaminated property, a contaminated area or an area that's undergoing cleanup. For all applicants, they will have to show unmet recovery needs, continuing unmet recovery needs at this time. There are two sets of applicants. There are those applicants that have already received some funding from HUD for their recovery, and there are those applicants that will have not previously received a CDBG disaster recovery grant. We will be looking at those applications a little bit differently, particularly for those applicants that have received CDBG disaster recovery funds. We will be looking to make sure that what you're listing as unmet recovery needs are not things you're planning to expend your existing grant to address. So to that extent, on the housing measure, we begin each of these with a question, and then you need to answer the question. For grantees that already have a CDBG grant, we ask the question, how are other CDBG-DR allocations inadequate for addressing remaining housing needs? You can demonstrate that by showing the number of households that would continue to be displaced absent this additional funding, or a number of homes or rental units that will not be served because there isn't enough funding. For those applicants who do not have existing CDBG disaster recovery funds, the question is how many households are still displaced from housing due to disaster, or how many housing units that were damaged by the disaster have not yet been repaired. And our threshold there for qualifying as having continuing unmet recovery needs is at least 20 households that are still damaged or are displaced. For infrastructure, the same basic kinds of questions apply here. For infrastructure, what damage to permanent infrastructure has not been repaired due to inadequate resources in or serving the most impacted and distressed areas? And for our grantees that have CDBG disaster recovery funds, for which no CDBG disaster recovery funds have been identified in an action plan. For both types of applicants, essentially you're presenting the same thing. You're going to provide us the project information, the amount of funding that's required to complete the project, and why the existing funding is not adequate to address that. We're looking for showing $400,000 of minimum unfunded permanent infrastructure repair to meet this requirement. This can include your local match requirement for FEMA or DOT. There's some special information about how the match requirements for the Corps of Engineer programs that you should pay attention to if you're try to look at that. The next category of economic revitalization. Remember, only ORs here. You only have to meet one of these requirements for unmet recovery needs. For economic revitalization, the question is, what is the extent of continuing unmet economic revitalization recovery needs due to the qualifying disaster in the most impacted and distressed target areas that cannot be addressed with the existing funds? In this case, there's 5 businesses with remaining repair needs, or at least or there's been more than a 10% decrease in revenues for the businesses associated with the disaster. And you need to include a narrative to explain how these things were caused by the qualifying disaster. For environmental degradation, you need to show what environmental damages from the qualifying disaster has not been addressed and cannot be addressed with existing resources. And that environmental degradation must threaten the long-term recovery of critical natural resources and place housing, infrastructure, and/or economic revitalization at risk. Again, you'll have to demonstrate there's at least $400,000 of remaining damage that can't be met by other resources. So what data can you use for these purposes? For housing, if you're running an existing CDBG disaster recovery program, you'll need to show to us that if you have a housing program that you're running, that your wait list exceeds the amount of funding that you have available. If you're not running a CDBG disaster recovery housing program, you would need to provide other information about continuing unmet needs, and that can include a windshield survey, for example, in the most impacted area. If you do pursue that, you'll need to provide us addresses and information on at least 9 of those addresses confirming that this remaining damage is due to the disaster and that they have inadequate funding to repair the damage. For infrastructure, we're going to be looking for an engineering report with estimated repair amounts. We're going to be looking for sources and uses statements for projects that are demonstrating their funding shortfall. So we'll be looking to say, what was the total damage? How much do you have from other resources, whether it be FEMA or the Corps of Engineers or Department of Transportation? How much is left to be funded there? And an explanation of why the existing CDBG-NDR resources, if you have that, are inadequate to meet that repair need. For economic revitalization, the applicants need to supply a narrative description of how of their needs, and they'll need to use. They can use a windshield survey that shows the number of businesses, as well as a survey of at least 5 businesses that confirm that the damage and repairs are due to the disaster and that they had inadequate resources to address that. Again, we'll need addresses of the businesses with continuing needs. An alternative approach on economic revitalization is to demonstrate that the businesses that were affected by the disaster had a reduction in revenue. In this case, you will again have to identify the businesses and tell us, provide some detailed information about how the disaster caused a reduction in revenues. One important note about these survey data is that they are going to be sensitive data. Well, it's only a small number of cases. How you provide that data to us needs to be provided in a secure way, and we'll provide guidance on how to do that. The last topic here is environmental degradation on how to collect data. This will require a detailed report from a reputable public or private organization that describes the damage. And while we know some of these reports may have been done some time ago, and that is fine, we do need to have a certification that the damage that was indicated in the report remains to be addressed. So you would have to provide a certification for any of these reports that are older than March 2014. One point I forgot to make on the windshield survey for both the businesses and the housing is exactly what the windshield survey is. The concept is you in the target area, it's just essentially driving through, and if you can visually see the impact of the disaster and it looks like recovery hasn't occurred, that's what a windshield survey is. And so you can identify addresses that appear to be damaged, and you can confirm that with the small survey we're asking for here. Which brings me to that first slide I raised before, our recap. So we're going to need information that shows the area is most impacted and distressed and has continuing unmet recovery needs. If you're in the if the area you want to target is in one of the 64 counties already identified by HUD as most impacted and distressed, you do not have to again submit data to support the first two categories, but you will need to submit data to support the last category, unmet recovery needs. For all other applicants, you will need to show a most impacted characteristic, only one of the categories we've indicated here. For distress categories, only one of these categories in that area you identify as most impacted. And again, you only have to show one of the categories of unmet recovery needs to meet this requirement. With that, I turn it back to Carrie.
Thanks, Todd. So I just wanted to come back to the brief slide that we mentioned in the beginning about the unique review process that is a pre-application review process for thresholds that is unique to this NOFA. And that is HUD's review in the first 45 days. HUD will only do this review on at the request of an applicant. We want to standardize these requests, if at all possible, to be limited to the data that Todd presented and the requirements as they are set forth in Appendix G, but at the same time, HUD does not include a standard form in the NOFA. That said, we will provide a sample letter on the Resilient Recovery website, and I will provide you with that website address at the end of this presentation, so that you can standardize your submission. Now, to the extent that you are including multiple target areas and you want to address thresholds for multiple target areas, that is fantastic. We'd like you to put them all in the single letter request to HUD. HUD will only provide one written response to each applicant, and so if these are not included together, the first one submitted will likely be the first response that you will get. Now, HUD is naming the 45-day period as November 3rd, 2014, and we will accept letters that are submitted on or before November 3rd, 2014. The letter should be submitted by email in an electronic form to resilientrecovery@hud.gov. And as I mentioned, the sample letter is included online. These letters will be formatted to address your particular situation. So if you are an applicant that has already been that you have counties in your area that have already been designated as most impacted and distressed by HUD, your submission will look different from the submission of an applicant that has not received recovery assistance from HUD and therefore does not have HUD designated most impacted and distressed counties. This is a lot of information. It is all very clearly set forth in Appendix G to the NOFA, and so I encourage you to refer to that frequently. If you have a question that you cannot find, it may be in the NOFA, but just not co-located with the other information regarding thresholds. All questions may be submitted to resilientrecovery@hud.gov, and HUD will respond to questions either together as a group or individually that come into that email address. It's also very important to know that HUD is going to respond within 15 days of your submission if you request a determination within the first 45 days. So this will give you plenty of time to take in HUD's response and then address HUD's response one way or another in your full proposal that you will submit by the application deadline for Phase 1. When you submit your proposal, you may address the same target area that HUD has rejected in the first 45 days, but if you provide additional support, you may meet the threshold with your ultimate determination. And so there are a few items that must be submitted in a 45-day request. The first is just the standard applicant information. How do we respond to you? Who do we get in contact with if we can't access the data that's part of your submission, for example? So we need you to put in the subject line of the email that this is your 45-day request. We need you to include the applicant name, the name, title, email address, telephone number, and agency associated with the contact person who to whom HUD should respond. And we also want you to understand that, again, although thresholds are ultimately addressed in the rating factors, there is no page limit to this 45-day submission. You can submit it in a different format from the sample letter, but we would prefer it in the sample letter format. And but when you're formulating that submission, you should know that ultimately your narrative submission must become part of the rating, must be addressed as part of the rating factors in the NOFA, where you will have a page limit ultimately. So I'd like to just run over a few resources that are available to all applicants. They are all available online. So the first resource is grants.gov. Grants.gov will contain the NOFA and the supporting documents, including the appendices. And so it is available for your download. You need to click on Apply for Grants in the Applicants menu, and then you also need to click on Download an Application Package. And you can enter in the CDFA number that is unique to this particular proposal. In this case, it is 14.272. And then I'd also like to call your attention to the NOFA website, which is on HUD Exchange, and it will include a link to the NOFA on grants.gov. And then it's also going to include this webinar and all of the other webinars that HUD will be recording and putting out there as resources for grantees. Finally, it's going to include all of the data resources that Todd Shop is making available for grantees' use in putting together their most impacted and distressed and their unmet recovery needs thresholds. And then finally, there are going to be a number of resilience resources that are available on the Resilient Recovery website, the link to which is provided on the slide here. These resources are going to address research on disaster resilience and innovative recovery techniques, previous projects, things to think about that applicants can consider when putting together their Phase 1 and Phase 2 submissions to HUD. And so I encourage you to take advantage of all of these resources. And again, finally, email any question to resilientrecovery@hud.gov. This would include any of your questions about the threshold requirements. Thank you so much for your time and attention today. We really appreciate you joining us and being a part of this process as we launch our very first National Disaster Resilience Competition. Best of luck.